I'd like to continue our journey through the Gospel of Matthew as we look at some of the parables of Jesus. Parables which reveal the nature of the kingdom and what the kingdom is like and how we participate in the kingdom. Up to verses 51 to 53 in this segment. It is called the parable of the treasures that are new and the treasures that are old. It goes like this. In verse 51, Jesus says, "Do you understand all these things?" They answered, "Yes." So Jesus is checking to see if the apostles really understand. A lot of times we see the apostles in the Gospels saying yes and not really understanding, not having a clue at all as to what Jesus is saying. So when they say yes at this point, that they're understanding the parables, I think in some ways it could be a qualified yes. As we reflect on the apostles, even today, 2,000 years later, and reflect on the parables that the apostles were taught, we might say, what do some of these parables really mean? And as we ponder them and reflect on them, we discover new meanings, deeper meanings, things that we have missed in these parables. So they really are parables that it takes a lot to understand. And we might say, we're never going to fully understand, right? Because they're about the kingdom. And in the kingdom, there is mystery. So we don't fully understand it. So then Jesus replied, after they said their yes, and Jesus says, "Then every scribe who has been instructed in the kingdom of heaven is like the head of a household, who brings from his storeroom both the new and the old." So the apostles are kind of like the scribes. They've been instructed, right? And they've been instructed in what? In the kingdom of heaven. What is this kingdom like? What is this kingdom all about? What does it really mean to be a part of the kingdom of heaven? And so it's kind of like the head of a household. And he goes into the storeroom where he keeps the provisions. And he's looking for something new that would kind of maybe spice up the menu a little bit. You don't want to always cook the same old stuff. You want to jazz it up a bit. So you get something new. But then you want to kind of get something that's traditional, that's old, that's worked before, that your guests like. And sometimes you do that because, well, maybe the new thing won't go over that well, so I'll have the new and the old both together. And so that's what we are like. We have been instructed in the kingdom. So we are similar to that person who has the new and the old. Very, very important and significant for understanding Jesus and the parables. Are these parables completely new? They are not. They certainly are based in the tradition of the Hebrew Scriptures, the teachings of those who have come before Jesus, the prophets, the wisdom figures in particular. So a lot of the instruction of Jesus is based on things that have been taught. But there's also new elements that Jesus is adding to this. So it's important to realize that it's both the new and the old in terms of what Jesus is sharing. Some people will say, well, Jesus' teaching is completely different than the Hebrew Scriptures. We'd say, no, of course not. Jesus was Jewish. His audience was Jewish, primarily. Although we've seen, of course, there are some Gentiles that Jesus has encountered, but primarily over 90% Jewish. So we'd say, naturally, Jesus is going to use the teaching that they are familiar with, that he is familiar with. And Jesus has said on several occasions he's come to fulfill the Hebrew Scriptures and be really consistent with the Hebrew Scriptures. But Jesus adds a new element as well. And the new element, of course, is in his person. Jewish people were expecting a Messiah, an anointed one, a great prophet. But were they expecting someone like Jesus? We candidly say probably not. It certainly, in many ways, exceeds the expectation. And of course, this is always the way with God. When we have a certain expectation about God or about the way God is working in our lives, God exceeds that expectation. And when we think we know what God is going to do and how God is going to work, we are like, no, we don't. I mean, God exceeds. God goes beyond. God is transcendent. God is other. God is incarnate, close, personal, but also other, and that is the mystery of God, what we do not comprehend. When we think we know God, the prophets just laugh and say, you got to be kidding. You don't really know God. Because God is beyond that human understanding that we do have. So the Church of Matthew, Jesus used this term scribes. The Church of Matthew has some leaders within it who are designated as scribes. So this term scribes does not, of course, just refer to those who were in the Jewish religious community, but also in the Christian community referred to as scribes, so those who would write down the tradition. We see it in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 23, verse 34, towards the end of Matthew. Therefore, behold, I send to you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and pursue from town to town. So these people will be in the community. They will be prophets in the community, those who speak for God, proclaim the word of God. They are the prophets, the proclaimers. They challenge us to follow God more totally. And there are the wise men who reflect on the tradition and who give us new insights into the meaning of our faith. And they are going to be in that Christian community as well as, of course, in the Jewish community. And then the scribes. And the scribes would be those who would be kind of learned in the tradition. And we speak of those who were writing down some of these traditions in the early community. Of course, you have the proclamation first. You also have the written word. Those who would write letters, those who would write down parables and teachings. So that was present as well, the scribes. And of course, some of these were going to be killed. Some of these were crucified, in addition, of course, to Jesus. And some of them were scourged in the synagogues because of that tension in the early church between those who were in the synagogues and who did not accept Jesus, those who came to the synagogue and did accept Jesus as the Messiah and the Anointed One. And naturally, you can see that's going to be, inevitably have to be a tension in that community. And worshiping together, you can just imagine that, there they are, and some of the scriptures are proclaimed from the prophets, and those who accept Jesus as the Messiah say, well, that particular prophecy, that's about Jesus. Jesus has fulfilled that prophecy. And the others are like, no, we don't accept that. So you can see how that tension could happen in the community. Like the scribes of Israel, and these scribes would have been teachers. So they had that teaching office. They would go in and proclaim the teaching. The scribe is well versed in the Old. The scribe knows the Old, knows the Hebrew scriptures, knows the traditions, knows the customs. And still, of course, in the early Christian community, they would go to the temple, they would go to the synagogues, they would worship together, they would practice together. And many scholars, of course, who reflect on this say, well, isn't that the way it should be? The Jewish and Christian communities should be together and should share together. There's so much more in common in terms of their tradition and teachings and moral and ethical teachings. And they have that where there are differences. So naturally being together is important. And as you reflect on that, you wonder about anti-Semitism and persecutions and pogroms and all that, and say, well, how could they get it so wrong? Like Jesus said to the apostles, do you understand? They said, yes. We look on some of these things that happen and say, well, you Christians, you did not understand your faith too well because you persecuted your sisters and brothers whom you share so much with, so much tradition with. So how can you persecute them? That's crazy. So they can bring the old forth to connect it to the new and see, well, this is the connection. This is how the old and the new work together. And this is how they can be in harmony. This is how the teaching of Jesus reflects the teaching of Abraham, of Moses, of David, of the prophets. We see the connection there. The gospel is the fullness of the law. Gospel is not anti-law, not anti-tradition, it's the fullness. Jesus has come to complete in his person, by his life, by his witness, by his teaching. He has come to give us the fullness of the law. We have that fullness in the person of Jesus, whom we proclaim as Messiah, we proclaim as Son of God, we proclaim as second person of the Holy Trinity.